Welcome to Detective Tales, where mysteries unfold and every detail matters. Inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, this channel brings you classic-style detective stories filled with suspense, hidden motives, and unexpected revelations. Here, you'll walk alongside brilliant minds like Hercule Poirot and Miss Marple, unraveling puzzles where nothing is quite as it seems. Prepare yourself for intrigue, atmosphere, and a journey into the golden age of detective fiction. The case begins now.
Chapter 1. The Widow in Black and the Garden in Bloom. The invitation had arrived on cream-coloured paper, written in a careful copper-plate hand that spoke of good breeding and old-fashioned values. Miss Jane Marple turned it over thoughtfully as she sat in her small sitting-room, the afternoon sun casting gentle patterns through the lace curtains of her cottage in St. Mary Mead. "Tea at Rosemount House," she murmured to herself, reading the elegant script once more. "Mrs. Agnes Elwood requests the pleasure of your company." It had been nearly 2 months since Herbert Elwood's funeral, and Agnes had kept herself quite secluded since then. The whole village had been rather surprised by Herbert's sudden passing. He had seemed robust enough for a man of 73, though there had been whispers about his heart. There always were whispers in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected with a gentle smile. It was the nature of village life, and she had long ago learned that these whispers, however trivial they might seem, often contained kernels of truth that proved more significant than anyone might suppose. She glanced at the mantelpiece clock. 3:30. She had accepted the invitation for 4 o'clock tea, and punctuality was a virtue she held dear. Adjusting her hat and collecting her small handbag, she made her way through the village toward Rosemount House. The house stood at the end of Meadowbank Lane, set back from the road behind an impressive wrought-iron gate. It was a handsome Georgian property, built of warm, honey-coloured stone, with tall windows that caught the afternoon light. Herbert Elwood had inherited it from a bachelor uncle some 15 years ago, and it had always been considered one of the finer houses in the district. As Miss Marple approached the front door, she paused to admire the garden. Even from her position on the gravel drive, she could see that it was quite spectacular. The late June blooms were at their absolute peak, with roses climbing the walls in magnificent profusion, their perfume hanging heavy in the warm air. Delphiniums stood in stately rows, their blue spires reaching toward the sky, while beds of lavender bordered the main paths with military precision. The front door opened before she could reach for the brass knocker, and Agnes Elwood appeared, dressed in unrelieved black that made her pale complexion seem almost ethereal. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come." Agnes's voice carried the faint trace of an accent that spoke of good schools and careful upbringing. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 55, with prematurely silver hair, arranged in an elegant chignon, and grey eyes that seemed to hold shadows. "I do hope you won't mind if we take tea in the morning-room. The drawing-room still feels rather... well, Herbert's presence seems so strong there still." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, following her hostess through a hallway lined with watercolour landscapes. "Grief takes time to soften, doesn't it? There's no rushing these things." The morning-room was charming, with French doors that opened onto the garden. A small table had been set with delicate china painted with roses, and there were cucumber sandwiches, scones with jam and cream, and a selection of small cakes that looked as though they had come from the best bakery in Much Benham. "What a lovely prospect you have," Miss Marple observed, settling into her chair and gazing out at the garden. "Herbert must have been very proud of his roses." A fleeting expression crossed Agnes's face, something that might have been irony or perhaps regret. "Oh, Herbert took very little interest in the garden, I'm afraid. That was all Thomas's doing, our gardener. Such a treasure he was, always knowing exactly what each plant needed and when." She poured the tea with steady hands, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor when she lifted the delicate cup. "Unfortunately, Thomas left us about a month ago. Rather suddenly, I'm afraid. These elderly gardeners, you know, They sometimes take these unexpected notions to move on. Miss Marple accepted her tea and took a small sip. It was excellent, Earl Grey served at precisely the right temperature. How disappointing for you, particularly at this time. Did he give you much notice? None at all, actually. Agnes's laugh was a trifle forced. One morning I went to speak with him about the herbaceous border, and he was simply gone. Left his cottage quite tidy, I must say, but not a word of explanation. Rather inconsiderate, really, though I suppose at his age one must make allowances. Through the French doors, Miss Marple could observe the garden more closely. Every element seemed placed with mathematical precision, each flower bed edged with razor-sharp accuracy, the lawn striped in perfect parallel lines. It was undeniably beautiful, but there was something almost unnatural about its perfection, as though it were a stage set rather than a living, breathing garden. "You've maintained it beautifully in his absence," she remarked. "Oh, I've had help, of course. Young men from the village, though they lack Thomas's expertise." Agnes set down her cup with a slight clink against the saucer. "But enough about gardening, Miss Marple. I've been rather lonely since Herbert's passing, and I thought perhaps you might enjoy seeing the grounds. Would you care for a walk after tea? The roses are particularly fine this year." There was something in Agnes's manner, a certain tension beneath the conventional politeness, that aroused Miss Marple's interest. She had encountered this quality before in people who carried secrets, who lived with the constant effort of maintaining appearances while something troubled worked beneath the surface. "That sounds delightful," she replied. "I'm always eager to see a well-tended garden." They finished their tea with pleasant conversation about village matters, the upcoming summer fete, and the new curate's rather modern ideas about church services. But Miss Marple found herself watching her hostess carefully, noting the way Agnes's eyes would drift toward the garden, the occasional pause in conversation, as though she were listening for something. When they finally stepped out onto the terrace, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the immaculate lawn. Agnes led the way along the main path, pointing out various plantings with what seemed like genuine knowledge and affection. They admired the climbing roses that adorned the south wall of the house, their blooms so perfect they might have been arranged by a florist. "Thomas had such a way with roses," Agnes murmured, touching a particularly beautiful bloom with gentle fingers. "He said the secret was in understanding what each variety needed to thrive. Some require constant attention, others prefer to be left quite alone." They moved on to inspect the herbaceous borders, where delphiniums, foxgloves and hollyhocks created a tapestry of blue, purple and white. Miss Marple found herself increasingly intrigued by the garden's almost theatrical perfection. In her own small plot she had learned to accept a certain amount of natural chaos, the way some plants insisted on growing where they pleased rather than where they were planted. But here every stem seemed to know its place, and keep to it with unwavering discipline. "You mentioned that Thomas left rather suddenly," she said as they paused beside a sundial, whose bronze surface gleamed in the afternoon light. "Was he quite elderly?" "Sometimes these old gardeners become rather set in their ways." "Oh, Thomas wasn't terribly old. Perhaps 60 or so, though he'd been here for nearly 15 years. Agnes's voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. "He came to us not long after Herbert inherited the house. Such a quiet man, very devoted to his work. Herbert always said he was worth his weight in gold." They had reached the far end of the garden now, where a small greenhouse stood among a grove of fruit trees. Miss Marple noticed that while the rest of the garden maintained its pristine order, this area seemed slightly less manicured, as though it had been recently disturbed and hastily restored. "What a charming spot," she observed, noting the way the late afternoon light filtered through the apple trees. "Rather peaceful, isn't it?" Agnes paused, her hand resting on the greenhouse door handle. For a moment her composed expression flickered, revealing something that might have been anxiety or perhaps fear. "Yes," she said quietly. "Thomas always said this was his favourite corner of the garden. He spent hours here, tending his seedlings and planning new plantings." She turned away from the greenhouse abruptly. Shall we head back? The evening air can be quite damp and I wouldn't want you to catch a chill." As they walked back toward the house, Miss Marple found herself glancing back at the greenhouse and the area around it. There was something about that particular spot that seemed to call for closer inspection, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what had caught her attention. The shadows were lengthening as they reached the terrace, and Agnes seemed eager to conclude their visit. She thanked Miss Marple warmly for coming, pressed a small bouquet of roses into her hands, and saw her to the front gate with all the courtesy one could wish. But as Miss Marple walked back through the village toward her cottage, she found herself thinking not about the perfect roses or the elegant tea service, but about the fleeting expressions that had crossed Agnes Elwood's face, the slight tremor in her hands, and the way she had hurried them away from that corner of the garden, where the greenhouse stood sentinel among the fruit trees. In her experience, gardens, like people, rarely achieved such perfection without considerable effort to conceal their natural imperfections. And in both cases, she had learned, the most interesting truths often lay buried just beneath the carefully maintained surface. Chapter 2. A Footprint by the Greenhouse. Miss Marple had always been an early riser, a habit formed in childhood, and reinforced by a lifetime of observing that the most interesting events often occurred when most people were still abed. On the morning following her tea with Agnes Elwood, she found herself awake before 6 o'clock, her mind turning over the curious impressions of the previous afternoon. The morning was particularly fine, with that clarity of light that comes after a night of gentle rain. As she prepared her simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, she found her thoughts returning repeatedly to Rosemount House and its too-perfect garden. There had been something about Agnes's behaviour near the greenhouse that nagged at her memory, the way one might worry at a loose tooth with the tongue. After breakfast, she decided to take her morning constitutional a little earlier than usual. Her route would naturally take her past Rosemount House, and if she happened to notice anything of interest about the property in the clear morning light, well, that would simply be the consequence of maintaining her regular habits. The village was quiet at this hour, with only the milk cart making its rounds and Mrs. Bantry's spaniel sniffing around the churchyard gate. Miss Marple walked briskly, her keen eyes taking in the familiar sights with the attention of someone who had learned that the smallest changes often signalled the most significant events. As she approached Meadowbank Lane, she could see Rosemount House through the morning mist that still clung to the lower parts of the garden. The wrought-iron gate stood slightly ajar, which struck her as odd, as Agnes had been most careful to close them properly the evening before. Miss Marple paused, ostensibly to admire the climbing roses that cascaded over the stone wall, but actually to observe the property more closely. It was then that she noticed the footprints. They were clearly visible in the soft earth of the flower border that ran alongside the drive, where the previous night's rain had left the soil dark and receptive to impressions. Someone had walked there recently, their feet leaving deep marks in the carefully cultivated bed. But what made these prints particularly interesting was their location and direction. They led not toward the front door, as one would expect of a legitimate visitor, but around the side of the house toward the back garden. Miss Marple glanced around to ensure she was not observed, then stepped closer to the gate. The prints were those of a woman's shoe, she noted, judging by their size and shape. The heel marks were particularly distinct, suggesting shoes of good quality with substantial heels. They appeared fresh, made some time during the night or very early morning while the ground was still soft from rain. More intriguing still was the fact that the prints seemed to show hesitation. In several places the impressions overlapped, as though the person had paused, perhaps listening or looking about before proceeding. Near a particularly dense clump of rhododendrons, the prints disappeared entirely, suggesting that whoever had made them had stepped onto the grass to avoid detection. Miss Marple found herself facing a dilemma. Her natural curiosity urged her to follow the trail, but her innate sense of propriety reminded her that she would be trespassing on private property. She stood for several moments weighing these considerations when fate intervened in the form of Doctor, Haydock's motor car approaching from the direction of Much Benham. The doctor slowed as he recognised her and leaned out of his window. "Morning, Miss Marple. You're about early today." "Good morning, Doctor. Yes, I find the morning air quite invigorating after last night's rain." She gestured toward the house. "I was just admiring Mrs. Elwood's beautiful garden. Such a credit to the village." Dr. Haydock followed her gaze and nodded approvingly. Herbert always kept it beautifully. Pity about that gardener of theirs leaving so suddenly. Thomas, wasn't it? Seemed a reliable sort of fellow. "Did you know him well?" "Not to say well, but I'd see him about the village from time to time. Kept himself to himself, as these gardening fellows often do. Lived in that cottage behind the Red Lion, though I believe he's moved on to relatives in Wales now." The doctor paused, then added with the casual air of someone imparting village gossip, "Rather sudden, his departure. Mrs. Elwood mentioned to my wife that he left without giving proper notice. Still, at his age, I suppose one must make allowances." Miss Marple filed this information away with interest. "His age? I had understood he was not terribly elderly." "Oh, 65 if he was a day, I'd say. Though he carried himself well for his years. Always struck me as the sort who'd work until he dropped." Dr. Haydock glanced at his watch. "Well, I must be off. Mrs. Fletcher's expecting me at 7, and punctuality is everything in this profession." As the doctor's car disappeared around the bend, Miss Marple found herself with renewed justification for her curiosity. If Thomas the gardener had indeed been 65 and apparently in good health, his sudden departure without notice seemed even more peculiar. In her experience, men of that age and reliability did not simply vanish without compelling reason. She looked once more at the footprints leading around the side of the house. The morning sun was growing stronger, and she realised that the evidence, such as it was, would not remain clear for much longer. Making a decision that she would later reflect upon with some amusement, she pushed open the gate and followed the trail. The prints led her along the side of the house, past well-tended flower beds and beneath windows that remained curtained against the morning light. She moved carefully, keeping to the grass where possible, and pausing frequently to listen for any sounds from within the house. The prints became less distinct as they reached the back garden, but their general direction was clear enough. They led toward the greenhouse. As Miss Marple approached the small building where she and Agnes had paused the previous afternoon, she noticed several things that had escaped her attention during their guided tour. The area around the greenhouse showed signs of recent disturbance. While the main garden maintained its mathematical precision, here the soil had been dug and relaid, though with considerable care to disguise the fact. More telling still was what she discovered near the greenhouse door. Partially hidden beneath a large hosta plant, something white caught her eye. Bending down with some difficulty, she retrieved a lady's glove, made of fine kid skin and obviously of good quality. It was slightly soiled and had clearly been there for some time, though not so long as to be badly deteriorated by weather. The glove was small, suitable for a woman with delicate hands, and bore the maker's mark of a fashionable London establishment. More intriguingly, it appeared to have been deliberately concealed rather than simply dropped, pushed down among the hosta leaves as though someone had wanted to hide it but had not had time for proper disposal. Miss Marple examined the glove carefully, noting its style and condition. It was not new, but neither was it old. The leather showed the kind of wear that came from regular use by someone who cared for her possessions but was not precious about them. There was a small stain on the palm that looked like it might be soil, and a tiny tear near the wrist seam. As she stood holding the glove, she became aware of movement in the house. A curtain twitched at an upstairs window, and she realised that her presence in the garden might soon be discovered. Quickly she slipped the glove into her handbag and made her way back toward the front of the property, taking care to avoid the flower borders where her own footprints might be noticed. She had just reached the gate when Agnes Elwood appeared on the front steps, wrapped in a dark blue dressing gown and looking considerably less composed than she had the previous afternoon. "Miss Marple? Whatever are you doing here at this hour?" "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple replied with perfect equanimity. "I do apologise for the early intrusion. I was taking my morning walk and noticed that your gate was standing open. I thought perhaps I should check that everything was quite all right." Agnes's hand went to her throat, a gesture that Miss Marple had observed often in people who were attempting to maintain their composure under stress. "Open? But I'm certain I closed it properly last evening." "These old latches can be rather unreliable," Miss Marple observed gently. "Perhaps the wind caught it during the night. Such a lovely morning after the rain, isn't it? Your garden looks particularly beautiful in this light." Yes, it does." Agnes seemed to gather herself together with visible effort. "Thank you for your concern, Miss Marple. It was very thoughtful of you to check. I must have been careless with the latch." "Think nothing of it, my dear. I hope I haven't disturbed your rest too much." "Not at all. I was already awake." Agnes paused, then added, "I'm afraid I don't sleep terribly well these days. The house seems so large and empty without Herbert." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Grief affects us all differently. Some find comfort in routine, others in change. There's no right or wrong way to manage such things. As she spoke, she noticed that Agnes kept glancing toward the back garden, as though expecting to see something there. Her fingers worried at the belt of her dressing gown, and there was a tension in her posture that suggested considerable inner turmoil. "Well, I mustn't keep you from your morning," Miss Marple said finally. "Do take care of that gate latch, won't you? One can't be too careful these days." Yes, of course. Thank you again, Miss Marple." As she walked back toward the village, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's discoveries. The footprints, the concealed glove, Agnes's obvious distress, and now the mysterious nighttime visitor who had left the gate ajar, all combined to create a picture that was far from the peaceful widowhood that Agnes was attempting to present to the world. The glove in her handbag seemed to weigh more than its actual substance would suggest. She had encountered such objects before, items that appeared insignificant, but proved to be keys to understanding much larger mysteries. In her experience, people rarely lost such things by accident in places where they had no legitimate reason to be. By the time she reached her own cottage, Miss Marple had formed several theories about the events at Rosemount House. None of them were particularly comforting, and all of them suggested that Agnes Elwood's troubles were far from over. As she prepared her second cup of tea of the day, she found herself thinking about gardens and the secrets they might conceal. In her own small plot, she had learned that the most beautiful flowers sometimes grew in the most unexpected places, nourished by what lay buried beneath the surface. She suspected that Rosemount House's perfect garden might be concealing something far less beautiful than its magnificent bloom suggested. Chapter 3. The Letter She Burned. The afternoon of the following day found Miss Marple once again at Rosemount House, though this time her visit was entirely unplanned. She had been returning from the post office, where she had posted a letter to her nephew Raymond when she encountered Mrs. Bantry near the village green. "Jane, my dear, I was just thinking about you," Mrs. Bantry had declared in her characteristically emphatic manner. "I've promised to deliver some parish magazines to Agnes Elwood, but Arthur has commandeered the motor car for some mysterious business in Much Benham. You wouldn't be an angel and help me carry them, would you? I know she'd be delighted to see you again." Miss Marple had agreed readily enough, though she privately suspected that Mrs. Bantry's request had less to do with the weight of the magazines than with her friend's well-known curiosity about the recently widowed Mrs. Elwood. Dolly Bantry had always possessed an insatiable appetite for village affairs, and the sudden departure of the gardener Thomas had provided ample fodder for speculation. They walked together along Meadowbank Lane, Mrs. Bantry chattering about the upcoming summer fete and the new organist's rather modern interpretation of hymn arrangements. Miss Marple listened with one ear while observing that the gate to Rosemount House was now properly secured with what appeared to be a new and a more substantial latch. "Such a beautiful property," Mrs. Bantry remarked as they approached the front door, "though I must say it seems rather large for one person. I do hope Agnes isn't finding it too much to manage on her own." The door was opened by Agnes herself, who appeared genuinely pleased to see them, though Miss Marple noticed a certain tightness around her eyes that suggested she had not been sleeping well. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple, how lovely! Do come in, won't you? I was just having tea in the drawing-room." Miss Marple observed the drawing-room with interest, as it was the first time she had been invited into this more formal space. It was a handsome room, furnished with good pieces that spoke of comfortable circumstances and refined taste. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, and the walls were hung with watercolours of local scenes. A writing desk stood near the window, its surface neat and uncluttered. As they settled themselves with their tea, Mrs. Bantry launched into an animated account of village news, peppered with questions about Agnes's plans for the property and her adjustment to widowhood. Miss Marple contributed little to this conversation, preferring to observe her hostess's reactions and the subtle details of her surroundings. It was during a brief lull in Mrs. Bantry's monologue that they heard the distinctive sound of the postal van approaching along the lane. Agnes started slightly at the noise, her hand trembling as she set down her teacup. "Excuse me for just a moment," she said, rising from her chair. "I believe that may be the afternoon post." She left the room, and Miss Marple could hear her footsteps crossing the hall to the front door. Mrs. Bantry continued to chatter, but Miss Marple found herself listening to the muffled conversation between Agnes and the postman. When their hostess returned, she carried several letters in her hand, but Miss Marple noticed that she was gripping one particular envelope rather tightly. "Nothing important, I hope?" Mrs. Bantry inquired with the casual interest that often masked deeper curiosity. "Just the usual business correspondence," Agnes replied, though her voice carried a note of strain. "If you'll forgive me, I should just glance through these quickly. Please, do help yourselves to more cake." She moved to the writing desk by the window and began to sort through the letters. Miss Marple watched discreetly as Agnes opened the first few pieces of correspondence, setting them aside with apparent indifference. But when she reached the letter she'd been gripping so tightly, her entire demeanour changed. The envelope bore what appeared to be expensive stationery, cream-coloured and heavy, with writing in a bold, masculine hand. As Agnes opened it, Miss Marple noticed that her fingers were trembling quite visibly. She read the contents quickly, her face growing progressively paler, and then, to Miss Marple's considerable surprise, she moved swiftly to the fireplace. "Rather warm for a fire, isn't it?" Mrs. Bantry observed as Agnes knelt beside the grate where a small coal fire burned despite the mildness of the afternoon. "I find I feel the cold more these days," Agnes replied, but her voice was tight with suppressed emotion. Without hesitation she thrust the letter into the flames, watching intently as the paper caught and began to curl. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught several details in that brief moment. The letter had been written on matching stationery to the envelope, and she glimpsed what appeared to be a formal letterhead before the flames consumed it. More significantly, she noticed the distinctive sweet smell that arose from the burning paper, the unmistakable scent of sealing wax that had been used to secure the envelope. "Only tedious business," Agnes said, rising from the fireplace and brushing her hands together with rather more force than necessary. "One does accumulate such a quantity of tiresome correspondence." But Miss Marple had observed the expression on Agnes's face as she watched the letter burn, and it had been far from the mild irritation one might feel toward tedious business. It had been the look of someone destroying something that posed a genuine threat. The remainder of their visit passed pleasantly enough, though Miss Marple noticed that Agnes seemed distracted and frequently glanced toward the fireplace where the ashes of the letter had settled among the coals. When they finally took their leave, she pressed their hands with unusual warmth and thanked them repeatedly for their kindness in calling. As they walked back through the village, Mrs. Bantry was full of observations about Agnes's appearance and manner. "She's looking quite drawn, don't you think? I suppose grief affects people differently, but she seems rather more distressed now than she did immediately after Herbert's funeral. And burning that letter, Jane. Most peculiar behaviour, really. If it was truly just business correspondence, why not simply file it away or discard it properly?" Miss Marple murmured appropriate responses, but her mind was occupied with more troubling thoughts. In her experience, people burned letters for only a few reasons, and none of them were innocent. The careful way Agnes had isolated that particular piece of correspondence, the fear in her expression as she read it, and the deliberate destruction that followed all suggested that the letter had contained something far more significant than tedious business. The quality of the stationery had not escaped her notice either. Expensive paper and formal letterhead suggested official correspondence of some importance. Combined with the sealing wax, which was an old-fashioned touch rarely used in ordinary business communications, it painted a picture of something formal and possibly legal in nature. That evening, as Miss Marple sat in her small sitting room with her knitting, she found herself constructing various theories about the mysterious letter. Had it been from a solicitor regarding Herbert's estate? That seemed unlikely, as such matters would hardly require immediate destruction. A business associate with unfinished concerns? Again, legitimate business would not typically provoke such a reaction. The alternative possibilities were more disturbing. Blackmail was always a consideration when people burned correspondence so hastily, though Agnes Elwood seemed an unlikely victim for such schemes. But then, Miss Marple reflected, she had learned that the most respectable people often harboured the most surprising secrets. She thought, too, about the timing of recent events. Herbert Elwood's sudden death, the mysterious departure of the gardener Thomas, and now this urgent correspondence that required immediate destruction. In her experience, such coincidences were rarely accidental. The lady's glove still rested in her handbag, and she retrieved it now to examine it once more in the lamplight. The maker's mark indicated a shop in Bond Street, the sort of establishment that catered to ladies of quality and means. The size suggested delicate hands, and the wear pattern indicated regular use by someone who was careful with her possessions. As she studied the glove, Miss Marple found herself wondering about its owner. Had it belonged to Agnes herself, lost during some midnight expedition to the greenhouse? The size seemed about right, though she had not had opportunity to observe Agnes's hands closely enough to be certain. Or had it been dropped by the mysterious night visitor, whose footprints she had discovered in the flower border? The more she considered the accumulating evidence, the more convinced she became that Agnes Elwood was not the simple grieving widow she appeared to be. The perfect garden, the missing gardener, the furtive destruction of correspondence, and the signs of nighttime activity all suggested a woman under considerable pressure, maintaining a facade of normalcy while dealing with circumstances that were anything but normal. Miss Marple set down her knitting and gazed thoughtfully out at her own small garden, where the evening shadows were beginning to gather among the roses. Tomorrow, she decided, she would make some discreet inquiries about the mysterious Thomas and his sudden departure from Rosemount House. In her experience, gardeners were observant people who noticed things that others missed, and their sudden disappearances usually had very good reasons behind them. Chapter 4. The Gardener. No one remembers. Miss Marple had always found that the most reliable source of village information was not the post office or even the vicarage, but rather the small establishments where working people gathered for their modest refreshments. With this principle in mind, she made her way the following morning to Polly's tea shop, a humble establishment that catered primarily to gardeners, delivery men, and domestic staff from the larger houses. The proprietress, Mrs. Polly Hartwell, was a woman of middle years whose cheerful disposition and excellent memory for faces made her establishment a natural gathering place for gossip and local news. Miss Marple had patronised the shop occasionally over the years, and she knew that Polly could be relied upon for accurate information about the comings and goings of village residents. "Miss Marple, what a pleasant surprise," Polly called out as she entered the small, steamy interior. "Not often we see you here of a morning. Will it be tea and a bun, then?" "That would be lovely, thank you." Miss Marple settled herself at a small table near the window, from which she could observe the street while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. "Such a busy morning in the village. I do hope I'm not taking a table needed by your regular customers." Not at all, though you're quite right about it being busy. Seems like everyone's been in this morning, what with the weather being so fine and all the gardens needing attention." Polly brought over a steaming cup and a fresh currant bun. "Of course, it's not the same since old Thomas left Rosemount House. He was one of my regulars, he was. Always stopped by on Friday mornings for his tea and a chat about the weather. Miss Marple seized upon this opening with the skill of long practice. Thomas the gardener? Yes. I heard he'd moved on rather suddenly. Such a pity, as Mrs. Elwood spoke so highly of his work. Sudden's the word for it, right enough. Polly settled into the chair opposite, clearly prepared for a proper conversation. One day he's here as usual, talking about his plans for the autumn planting, and the next day young Billy Fletcher's telling everyone that Thomas's cottage is standing empty with the rent paid up through the month. This was interesting information, and Miss Marple filed it away carefully. Paid up through the month? That suggests he hadn't been planning to leave immediately. That's just what I said to Mrs. Craddock when she mentioned it. If a man's planning to leave, he doesn't pay rent he won't be using, does he? Unless he's the sort that's very particular about his obligations, which Thomas was, I'll grant you that. Did he mention anything about relatives in Wales? I believe someone said he'd gone to family there. Polly looked puzzled. Wales? That's the first I've heard of Wales. Thomas always said he had no family to speak of, been on his own since he was a young man. Just me and the plants, he used to say. They're the only family I need. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. How very curious. Perhaps I misunderstood. Did he seem troubled about anything in those last weeks? Sometimes these older gentlemen worry about their health or their ability to continue working. Well, now that you mention it, Polly leaned forward conspiratorially. He did seem a bit different the last few times he was in. More quiet than usual, and Thomas was never what you'd call a chatty sort to begin with. And there was something else. Something I didn't think much of at the time. Oh, the Friday before he disappeared, he asked me if I knew anything about the early morning postal delivery to the big houses. Wanted to know what time the postman usually reached Rosemount House. Seemed an odd thing to be concerned about, but then gardeners do get interested in the most peculiar details sometimes. This was decidedly intriguing. Miss Marple filed this information alongside her memory of Agnes burning the letter the previous afternoon. Did he say why he was curious about the postal deliveries? No, just asked casual-like, but he seemed anxious about something, kept looking out the window as though he was expecting someone. Polly paused to serve another customer, then returned to their conversation. There was something else, too. He'd started carrying himself different, if you know what I mean. More careful-like, as though he was listening for something or watching out for someone. Before Miss Marple could pursue this line of inquiry further, the shop door opened to admit two more customers, whom she recognised as members of the domestic staff from various village households. She listened with interest as they settled at a nearby table and began their own discussion of local affairs. "Morning, Mrs. Jenkins, Mary," Polly called to the newcomers. "The usual, is it?" "If you please, Polly," replied the older of the two women, whom Miss Marple recognised as the cook from the vicarage. "Mary here was just telling me about the odd goings-on up at Rosemount House." Mary, a young woman who Miss Marple recalled worked as a housemaid for one of the families on the other side of the village, looked around nervously before speaking. "It's probably nothing, Mrs. Jenkins, but my cousin Bert delivers the milk up that way, and he says there's been lights on at all hours, middle of the night sometimes, moving about the house like someone can't sleep." "Grief affects people differently," Mrs. Jenkins observed sagely. "Some find comfort in keeping busy, others pace about like caged animals." "That's what I thought too," Mary continued. "But Bert says it's not just the house. He's seen lights in the garden as well, moving about near that greenhouse of theirs, and twice now he's found the gate standing wide open when he knows it was properly closed the night before." Miss Marple felt a small thrill of vindication. Her own observations had not been unique then. The nighttime activity at Rosemount House was becoming a pattern that multiple witnesses had noticed. "Perhaps Mrs. Elwood has taken up gardening herself," Polly suggested. "Some people find it soothing to work with plants when they're troubled." "At 3 a.m, Mary shook her head. "And there's something else. Something Bert didn't like to mention at first. He's heard voices sometimes coming from the garden. Not just Mrs. Elwood's voice, neither. A man's voice, speaking low and urgent-like." This revelation caused a considerable stir among the small group. Mrs. Jenkins clicked her tongue disapprovingly, while Polly's eyes grew wide with interest. A man's voice? You're certain of this? That's what Bert says, and he's not one for making up stories. Says it sounded like they were having some kind of argument, though he couldn't make out the words. Miss Marple found herself creating a mental timeline of these events. The mysterious conversations, the nighttime lights, the open gate, all occurring after Thomas's sudden departure and Herbert Elwood's death. It painted a picture of a woman under considerable stress, dealing with circumstances that required secretive meetings and nocturnal activities. "When did your cousin first notice these peculiar happenings?" she inquired gently. Mary considered this carefully. "He mentioned it first about 3 weeks ago, I think. Said he'd been noticing things for maybe a week before that. So call it a month, give or take. A month." Miss Marple noted that this timeline corresponded closely with Thomas's disappearance and, according to Dr. Haydock's earlier comment, with Agnes's inheritance of a sizable sum from her late husband. As the conversation moved on to other village matters, Miss Marple finished her tea and took her leave, her mind busy with the new information she'd gathered. The picture emerging was of a woman whose troubles had begun not with her husband's death, but in the weeks following it. The timing suggested that Herbert's death had precipitated a series of events that were still unfolding. Walking back through the village, she encountered Mr. Petherick, the elderly solicitor who handled legal affairs for many of the local residents. He greeted her warmly and fell into step beside her. "Beautiful morning, Miss Marple. I trust you're keeping well." "Very well, thank you, Mr. Petherick. And you? I imagine you've been quite busy with the usual summer complications of wills and estates." Indeed. Though I must say some matters prove more complex than others." He paused, then added, with the careful discretion of his profession, "I don't suppose you've seen much of Mrs. Elwood recently? I've been trying to reach her regarding some final details of her husband's estate, but she seems rather difficult to contact these days." "I called on her just yesterday, actually. She seemed well enough, though naturally still affected by her loss." Quite understandable. Though I must confess there are certain matters that require her attention sooner rather than later. Documents that need signing, decisions that can't be postponed indefinitely." He looked troubled. "I've sent several letters, but I'm not entirely certain they've reached her. Perhaps the postal service has been irregular." Miss Marple thought of the letter she'd seen Agnes burn the previous afternoon. "The post seems reliable enough in my experience. Perhaps she's simply not ready to deal with business matters just yet." Perhaps. Though in my experience delay in such matters often leads to greater complications later on. Mr. Petherick tipped his hat. "Well, I mustn't keep you, Miss Marple. Good day to you." As she continued toward her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on this final piece of information. If Mr. Petherick had been sending letters to Agnes regarding Herbert's estate, and if Agnes had been burning correspondence, it suggested that she was actively avoiding dealing with her late husband's affairs. This was curious behaviour for a woman who should have been eager to settle such matters and secure her financial position. The pattern was becoming clearer, though the complete picture remained elusive. A gardener who had asked about postal deliveries and then disappeared suddenly. A widow who burned letters from her solicitor and entertained mysterious visitors in the middle of the night. And somewhere in this tangle of secrets, a lady's glove hidden near a greenhouse, and footprints in the flower beds that spoke of furtive nighttime activities. Miss Marple had learned long ago that in matters of human behaviour, the most innocent explanations were often the least likely to be true. The accumulating evidence suggested that Agnes Elwood's troubles were far more serious than simple grief, and that the peaceful facade of Rosemount House concealed secrets that someone was very anxious to keep hidden. Chapter 5. Suspicion Grows Like Ivy. The weekly meeting of the Women's Institute provided Miss Marple with an ideal opportunity to observe the currents of village opinion regarding Agnes Elwood's circumstances. She had always found these gatherings to be remarkably efficient channels for the dissemination of local information, and she anticipated that the recent peculiarities at Rosemount House would feature prominently in the informal conversations that preceded the official business. The meeting was held, as usual, in the parish hall, and Miss Marple arrived precisely at the appointed time to find the usual collection of village ladies already assembled. Mrs. Price Ridley, the chairwoman, was arranging her papers at the head table, while the other members clustered in their customary groups, their voices creating a gentle murmur that spoke of shared confidences and mutual interest in their neighbours' affairs. Miss Marple took her accustomed seat near the window, and was soon joined by Mrs. Bantry, who appeared unusually animated and clearly bursting with news to share. "Jane, my dear, I'm so glad you're here early," Mrs. Bantry whispered, leaning close. "You'll never guess what I've discovered about our mysterious widow." Before Miss Marple could respond, they were joined by Miss Hartnell, whose formidable presence and well-known appetite for gossip made her a central figure in the village's informal intelligence network. "Are we discussing Agnes Elwood?" Miss Hartnell inquired, settling her considerable bulk into the chair beside them, "because I have some rather interesting information that I think you'll find quite illuminating." Mrs. Bantry's eyes sparkled with anticipation. "Do tell, Clara. We were just wondering about her sudden prosperity." "Prosperity?" Miss Marple inquired gently, though she suspected she knew what was coming. "Oh, yes, my dear," Miss Hartnell replied with evident satisfaction. "It seems our grieving widow has come into rather more than anyone expected. I had it from Mrs. Sampson at the bank, who mentioned it quite casually when I was making my deposit yesterday." Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Sampson, the bank manager's wife, was notorious for her inability to keep confidential information to herself, a failing that had made her both a valuable source of intelligence and a considerable liability to her husband's professional discretion. "Herbert's insurance policy, I suppose," Mrs. Bantry suggested, though I hadn't heard it was particularly substantial. "That's just the point," Miss Hartnell continued, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "It wasn't just the insurance. According to Mrs. Sampson, there was also a rather significant sum that Herbert had apparently set aside in a separate account. Quite a surprise to everyone, including the solicitors, I gather." This was indeed interesting news, and Miss Marple filed it away with a growing collection of facts surrounding the Elwood household. A secret account suggested financial arrangements that Herbert had chosen not to discuss with his wife, which raised questions about the nature of their marriage and his reasons for such secrecy. "How much are we talking about?" Mrs. Bantry asked with the directness that was one of her more endearing characteristics. Miss Hartnell glanced around to ensure they were not overheard. Mrs. Sampson suggested it was in the region of several £1,000s, quite enough to make a significant difference to one's circumstances. "And yet," Mrs. Bantry observed thoughtfully, "Agnes continues to live exactly as she did before. One might expect a woman who had suddenly acquired such means to make some changes to her lifestyle." "Precisely what I thought," Miss Hartnell agreed. "Most peculiar behaviour, really. If I had come into such a sum, I can assure you I wouldn't be darning my stockings and growing my own vegetables." Miss Marple listened to this exchange with growing interest. In her experience, people who had legitimate access to unexpected wealth rarely continued to live as though they were still constrained by their previous circumstances. The fact that Agnes was maintaining her frugal habits, despite her improved financial position, suggested either remarkable self-discipline or some compelling reason to avoid drawing attention to her changed circumstances. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Carmichael, the doctor's wife, who brought with her the slightly breathless air of someone who had hurried to share important news. "Good afternoon, ladies," she said, settling into the remaining chair at their small circle. "I do hope I'm not late, but I've just had the most extraordinary conversation with my cook, and I simply had to share it with someone sensible." "What sort of conversation?" Mrs. Bantry inquired eagerly. "Well, it concerns Agnes Elwood, as it happens. My cook's sister works for the postman, helping with the sorting and such, and she's noticed something rather odd about the mail delivery to Rosemount House." Miss Marple felt a familiar quickening of interest. The postal deliveries had already featured in her investigation, and any new information about them might prove significant. "What sort of oddity?" Miss Hartnell demanded. "It seems that Mrs. Elwood has been receiving rather more correspondence than one might expect for a recently widowed lady living quietly in the country. Letters from London, some of them quite official-looking, and always marked personal and confidential or urgent or some such thing. Business matters, I should think, Mrs. Bantry suggested. Settling Herbert's affairs must involve a considerable amount of correspondence. That's what one would assume, Mrs. Carmichael agreed. But here's the curious part. According to the postman's assistant, many of these letters are not from solicitors or banks or the usual sources of estate business. They're from private addresses, and some of them bear the marks of having been sent by special delivery or express post. Miss Marple found this information particularly intriguing when combined with her own observation of Agnes' burning correspondence. If the widow was receiving urgent letters from private individuals and then destroying them, it suggested communication of a personal rather than business nature, and probably of a troubling character. "Has anyone noticed whether she responds to these letters?" she inquired. "That's another curious thing," Mrs. Carmichael replied. "The postman says she rarely sends any letters out, which seems odd if she's conducting active correspondence with multiple parties." Before their conversation could continue further, Mrs. Price Ridley called the meeting to order, and the ladies were obliged to turn their attention to the official business of organising the summer fête. However, Miss Marple found it difficult to concentrate on discussions of cake stalls and flower competitions when her mind was occupied with the emerging picture of Agnes Elwood's mysterious circumstances. During the tea interval that followed the formal proceedings, she found herself in conversation with Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, who had always impressed her as a sensible woman with a keen understanding of human nature. "I couldn't help overhearing your earlier discussion about Mrs. Elwood," Mrs. Clement said quietly. "I hope you won't think me indiscreet, but I feel I should mention that my husband has been rather concerned about her lately." "In what way?" "Well, she stopped attending church services for one thing, not immediately after Herbert's death, which would have been quite understandable, but only in the past few weeks. And when Leonard called to see if she needed any pastoral support, she seemed almost frightened to see him at the door." This detail fitted with the pattern of increasing isolation and anxiety that Miss Marple had been observing. Frightened in what way? She kept glancing over his shoulder as though she expected someone else to appear, and she seemed very anxious to conclude the visit quickly, quite unlike her usual courtesy. Leonard said he had the distinct impression that she was afraid of being seen talking to him. How very strange. Did he have any theories about what might be troubling her? Mrs. Clement hesitated before answering. "This is quite confidential, you understand, but Leonard mentioned that she seemed particularly concerned about being observed. She asked him several times whether anyone had seen him arrive, and she insisted on speaking to him in the back sitting-room rather than the front parlour, where she would normally receive visitors." The picture of a woman living in fear was becoming increasingly clear. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Clement for her confidence, and made her way home through the village, her mind busy with the implications of what she had learned. The accumulated evidence painted a portrait of Agnes Elwood as a woman under considerable pressure from unknown sources. The secret inheritance, the urgent correspondence that she destroyed rather than answered, the nighttime visitors, and now the apparent fear of being observed, all suggested circumstances far more complex than simple widowhood. As she prepared her evening meal, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the nature of secrets, and the lengths to which people would go to protect them. In her experience, the most dangerous secrets were often those that involved money and the past, and she was beginning to suspect that Agnes Elwood's troubles encompassed both. The lady's glove still rested in her drawer, wrapped carefully in tissue paper. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find a way to return it to its owner and observe the reaction it provoked. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that people's responses to unexpected confrontations often revealed more than hours of careful questioning ever could. The mystery of Rosemount House was deepening, and Miss Marple was becoming increasingly convinced that the perfect garden and the grieving widow were both facades concealing something far more sinister than the peaceful village setting would suggest. Chapter 6. A garden party with uneasy smiles. The annual summer fete at Rosemount House had been a tradition during Herbert Elwood's lifetime, and when Agnes announced her intention to continue hosting the event despite her recent bereavement, The village received the news with a mixture of approval and curiosity. Miss Marple, along with most of St Mary Mead, accepted the invitation with considerable interest in observing how their hostess would manage such a public gathering, given her recent peculiar behaviour. The afternoon of the fete dawned bright and clear, with the sort of golden sunshine that seemed to have been ordered especially for outdoor entertainments. Miss Marple arrived at the appointed hour to find the gates of Rosemont House thrown wide, and the garden transformed into a festival of colour and activity. Stalls had been erected along the main lawn, offering the usual selection of homemade preserves, needlework and garden produce that characterise such village events. A small marquee provided shelter for the tea service, while bunting strung between the trees added a festive air to the proceedings. The perfect garden provided an ideal backdrop for the celebration, its mathematical precision now serving as an elegant stage for the gathered villagers. Agnes herself moved among her guests with apparent composure, dressed in a navy blue dress that was suitably subdued for her mourning period, while still being appropriate for the occasion. Miss Marple observed her carefully, and noted that while she maintained the proper social graces, there was a certain tension in her manner, a watchfulness that suggested she was not entirely at ease, despite being surrounded by familiar neighbours. "Quite a turnout," Mrs. Bantry observed, joining Miss Marple near the rose arbour where she had positioned herself to observe the gathering. "Agnes has done Herbert proud, I must say. Though she does look rather strained, don't you think?" Miss Marple murmured agreement while continuing to watch their hostess. Agnes was currently engaged in conversation with the vicar and his wife, but her eyes kept straying toward the entrance gate as though she were expecting or dreading the arrival of someone in particular. The afternoon progressed pleasantly enough, with the usual rounds of polite conversation and examination of the various stalls. Miss Marple purchased a jar of Mrs. Hartwell's excellent strawberry jam and admired Miss Weatherby's display of prize dahlias, all while keeping a discreet eye on the subtle dynamics of the gathering. It was during the interval between the children's races and the judging of the flower competition that the incident occurred, which would later assume considerable significance in Miss Marple's reconstruction of events. Mrs. Price Ridley had organised a small display of antique garden tools near the greenhouse, borrowed from various village households, to create an exhibition of traditional English gardening through the ages. The collection included everything from ancient spades and hoes to delicate Victorian ladies' gardening implements, all carefully arranged on tables covered with white cloths. Miss Marple was examining a particularly fine example of an 18th century pruning knife when she noticed Agnes approaching the display with evident reluctance. She was accompanied by Colonel Melchett and his wife, who were expressing considerable interest in the historical aspects of the various tools. "This is quite remarkable," Colonel Melchett was saying, indicating a pair of ornate pruning shears with elaborately decorated handles. "Georgian, I should think, and still in excellent condition. Do you recognise it, Mrs. Elwood? Rather fine craftsmanship." Agnes glanced at the tool he indicated and immediately went very pale. For a moment Miss Marple thought she might actually faint, and she stepped forward ready to offer assistance if needed. "Are you quite all right, my dear?" Mrs. Melchett inquired with concern. "You've gone rather white." "I'm perfectly fine," Agnes replied, though her voice was strained and she kept her eyes averted from the pruning shears. "Perhaps just a touch of the heat. If you'll excuse me, I should check on the tea arrangements." She moved away quickly, but not before Miss Marple observed her glance back at the display, with what appeared to be genuine fear. More significantly, she noticed that Agnes quietly spoke to one of the village boys who was helping with the arrangements, and within minutes the antique pruning shears had been removed from the display and spirited away to some less prominent location. Miss Marple found this reaction deeply intriguing. The pruning shears had appeared to be perfectly ordinary antique garden tools, the sort of thing that might be found in any well-established household. Agnes's extreme response suggested that they held some particular significance for her, and her immediate action to have them removed indicated a desire to prevent others from examining them too closely. "Did you notice that curious little scene with the pruning shears?" a voice beside her inquired, and she turned to find Dr. Haydock observing the proceedings with professional interest. Indeed I did. Most peculiar reaction, don't you think? Quite out of character for Agnes, I'd say. She's normally composed to a fault, even under stress. The doctor paused thoughtfully, though I must say she's been looking rather unwell lately. Dark circles under the eyes, that sort of thing. Classic signs of someone who isn't sleeping properly. The effects of grief, perhaps. Perhaps. Though in my experience, grief tends to manifest differently. These looks more like anxiety, the sort that comes from ongoing worry rather than simple bereavement. Dr. Haydock glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. Between you and me, Miss Marple, I've been rather concerned about her. She's cancelled 2 appointments with me in the past month, which isn't like her at all. This information fitted with the pattern of avoidance that Miss Marple had been observing. Agnes seemed to be withdrawing from all her normal social contacts, as though she feared that regular interactions might reveal whatever secret she was protecting. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the tea tent, where Mrs. Bantry could be heard exclaiming over some mishap with the cake service. As they moved to investigate, Miss Marple noticed that several guests were beginning to take their leave, the afternoon having reached that natural conclusion point when people start to remember their evening obligations. She was preparing to make her own farewells when she encountered Agnes near the front gate, thanking departing guests with what appeared to be genuine relief that the event was drawing to a close. "Such a lovely afternoon, Mrs. Elwood," Miss Marple said warmly. "You've done Herbert's memory proud with such a successful gathering." "Thank you, Miss Marple. It was what Herbert would have wanted, I think." Agnes's smile seemed more natural now that the public event was ending, though she still appeared tired. He always said that the garden should be shared, not kept selfishly to ourselves. "Quite right, though I noticed you seemed distressed earlier, near the antique tool display. I do hope nothing was wrong." Agnes's composure faltered slightly. "Oh, that. No, nothing serious. Well, some of those old tools brought back rather sad memories. Herbert was quite fond of collecting such things, you know." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though she noticed that Agnes's explanation didn't quite ring true. If the pruning shears had belonged to Herbert and held sad memories, it seemed unlikely that Agnes would have them displayed at all, much less react with such apparent fear when she encountered them unexpectedly. As she walked home through the village in the golden light of early evening, Miss Marple reflected on the day's observations. The garden party had revealed new aspects of Agnes's situation, particularly her extreme reaction to the antique pruning shears and her obvious relief when the public event concluded. The pattern was becoming increasingly clear. Agnes Elwood was a woman living under considerable strain, maintaining a facade of normalcy while dealing with circumstances that caused her genuine fear. The missing gardener, the mysterious correspondence, the nighttime visitors, and now the disturbing reaction to garden tools all suggested a secret that was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. Miss Marple had encountered such situations before, and she knew that secrets under such pressure rarely remained hidden indefinitely. The question was whether Agnes would find the courage to seek help before her circumstances became truly dangerous, or whether events would take their course without intervention. The lady's glove still waited in her drawer, and Miss Marple was becoming increasingly convinced that the time had come to confront Agnes directly with the evidence she had been accumulating. In her experience, people living with dangerous secrets often welcome the opportunity to unburden themselves if approached with the right combination of sympathy and discretion. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay another call on Rosemount House, and this time her visit would have a very specific purpose beyond mere social courtesy. Chapter 7. The Broken Gate and the Whispered Threat. Miss Marple was awakened in the early hours of the morning by what sounded like the splintering of wood, followed by a muffled cry that seemed to come from the direction of Rosemount House. She lay still for a moment, listening intently, but the village had returned to its customary nocturnal silence. The church clock struck 3 as she rose from her bed and moved to the window, but the darkness revealed nothing unusual in the peaceful landscape beyond her garden. Nevertheless, something about the quality of that distant sound troubled her sufficiently that she found herself unable to return to sleep. She had learned over the years to trust such instincts, and the accumulating mysteries surrounding Agnes Elwood made any disturbance in that quarter worthy of investigation. When dawn finally broke, she dressed earlier than usual and set out for her morning walk, directing her steps naturally toward Meadowbank Lane. The morning air was crisp and clear, with that particular freshness that follows a night of light winds, and she found herself moving more briskly than was her usual custom. As she approached Rosemount House, the cause of the nocturnal disturbance became immediately apparent. The wooden side gate that provided access to the back garden hung askew on its hinges, the lower rail splintered as though it had been forced open with considerable violence. Fragments of wood lay scattered on the ground, and Miss Marple could see that the lock mechanism had been completely destroyed. She paused to examine the damage more closely, noting that the force had been applied from the outside, suggesting that someone had been attempting to gain entry rather than exit. The wood was freshly broken, the splinters still pale where they had torn away from the main structure, confirming that this destruction had occurred very recently. More troubling still were the traces of paint she discovered clinging to some of the splintered edges. The colour was a distinctive shade of green, and Miss Marple felt certain she had seen it recently, though she could not immediately place where. As she stood contemplating these discoveries, she heard footsteps approaching from within the garden, and Agnes appeared around the corner of the house, wrapped in a dark cloak and looking considerably more distressed than Miss Marple had ever seen her. "Miss Marple? What are you doing here so early?" Agnes's voice carried a note of near panic, and her face was pale with exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine fear. "I was taking my morning walk and noticed your gate," Miss Marple replied gently. "I was concerned that you might have had some sort of trouble during the night." Agnes glanced at the broken gate and her composure crumbled visibly. For a moment Miss Marple thought she might break down entirely, but with obvious effort she gathered herself together. "Someone tried to break in," she said simply. "I heard them around midnight trying to force the lock. When that failed, they must have used some sort of tool to smash the wood." "How frightening for you, my dear. Did you see who it was?" "No, I was too afraid to look out. I simply lay in bed and listened until they went away." Agnes's hands trembled as she spoke, and Miss Marple noticed that she kept glancing nervously toward the surrounding gardens as though expecting the intruder to reappear. "Have you reported this to the police?" Agnes's reaction to this suggestion was immediate and telling. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly. It was probably just some vagrant or perhaps young men playing pranks. I wouldn't want to make a fuss over nothing." Miss Marple found this explanation unconvincing. The damage to the gate suggested deliberate and determined effort rather than casual vandalism, and Agnes's obvious terror seemed disproportionate if she truly believed the incident to be harmless mischief. "Perhaps you heard them say something. Sometimes these incidents are less random than they appear." Agnes was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was barely above a whisper. "I did hear voices, a man's voice, speaking quite low, but I couldn't make out the words. And then—" She paused, as though reluctant to continue. "What is it, my dear?" "I thought I heard my name, just once, spoken quite clearly, and then something about time running out." Agnes shuddered visibly. It was probably nothing, just my imagination playing tricks in the darkness. Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. This was no random break-in attempt, but something far more sinister. Someone was deliberately intimidating Agnes, trying to frighten her into some course of action she was apparently reluctant to take. "You must be terribly unsettled by all this," she said compassionately. "Perhaps you should consider staying with friends for a few days until this unpleasantness passes." "I couldn't possibly leave the house unattended," Agnes replied quickly. "Besides, I'm probably being foolish about the whole thing. I'm sure it won't happen again." But even as she spoke, Miss Marple could see that she didn't believe her own words. Agnes looked like a woman who expected the harassment to continue, and who felt trapped by circumstances she couldn't or wouldn't explain. "If you're certain you'll be all right," Miss Marple said finally, "but please don't hesitate to call for help if you need it. The village may seem isolated, but we look after our own." Agnes thanked her with obvious gratitude, and Miss Marple took her leave, though not before she had memorised every detail of the damaged gate and its surroundings. As she walked back toward the village centre, she found herself thinking about the traces of green paint she had observed on the splintered wood. It was only when she passed the church that the significance of that particular shade became clear. The vestry door had recently been repainted in exactly that colour, a task undertaken by the church maintenance committee just the previous month. If the paint on Agnes's gate had come from the vestry door, it suggested that whoever had damaged the gate had been in contact with church property very recently. This realisation led her to alter her route slightly, taking her past the churchyard to examine the vestry door more closely. Her suspicions were confirmed when she discovered fresh scratches in the paint, as though something metal had scraped against the surface. Combined with the paint traces at Rosemount House, it painted a picture of someone who had used a tool taken from or stored near the church to break down Agnes's gate. The implications of this discovery were troubling. It suggested that the harassment of Agnes was not the work of casual strangers, but of someone familiar with the village and its resources, someone who knew where tools might be found, and who felt confident enough to use church property for their purposes. Miss Marple spent the remainder of her morning walk considering the various members of the community who would have access to the church and its outbuildings. The list was not particularly long, consisting mainly of the vicar himself, the church wardens, and the volunteers who helped with maintenance and cleaning. All of these were respectable people whom she had known for years, making the idea that one of them might be involved in threatening Agnes almost unthinkable. Yet the evidence was clear, and Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most respectable facades often conceal the most surprising secrets. Someone in St Mary Mead was systematically terrorising Agnes Elwood, and they were using their knowledge of the village to do so effectively. As she prepared her breakfast, she found herself thinking about the nature of the threat Agnes was facing. The whispered mention of time running out suggested that someone was trying to force her into making a decision or taking some action within a specific time frame. Combined with the mysterious correspondence she'd been receiving and burning, it painted a picture of a woman caught between competing pressures, unable to satisfy one demand without triggering another. The lady's glove still waited in her drawer, and Miss Marple realised that the time for subtle investigation had passed. Agnes was clearly in genuine danger, and the conventional approaches of village gossip and casual observation were insufficient to uncover the truth before serious harm occurred. That afternoon she decided she would pay another call on Rosemount House, and this time she would confront Agnes directly with the evidence she had been accumulating. The broken gate and the whispered threats had escalated the situation beyond the point where polite discretion was adequate protection for a woman living in fear. Chapter 8. The Poison in the Petunias. Miss Marple's plans for an afternoon confrontation with Agnes were interrupted by an urgent summons from Dr. Haydock, who appeared at her cottage door shortly after lunch, looking considerably more grave than was his usual custom. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might have a word," he said, accepting her invitation to step inside. "There's been rather a serious incident involving Mrs. Fletcher, and I believe it may be connected to some of the peculiar goings-on we've been observing lately." Mrs. Fletcher was a widow of modest means, who lived in one of the smaller cottages on the outskirts of the village. Miss Marple knew her as a quiet, sensible woman who kept largely to herself and was not given to dramatic gestures or complaints. "What sort of incident, Doctor?" "She's been taken quite violently ill, I'm afraid. Severe vomiting, difficulty breathing, rapid pulse, all the classic symptoms of plant poisoning. She's stable now, but it was touch and go for a while." Dr. Haydock settled into the chair she offered and accepted a cup of tea. "The curious thing is how she came to be poisoned in the first place." Miss Marple felt a familiar stirring of apprehension. "Plant poisoning, you said?" Digitalis, almost certainly. She'd prepared what she thought was a perfectly innocent herbal tea, using leaves from some plants she'd been given as a gift. Fortunately, she has a naturally cautious disposition, and only took a few sips before the bitter taste warned her something was wrong. Given as a gift? By whom? That's where the story becomes interesting. According to Mrs. Fletcher, Agnes Elwood called on her yesterday afternoon with a tray of potted plants. Petunias, she said. Excess from her own garden that she thought Mrs. Fletcher might enjoy. Very thoughtful gesture, or so it seemed. Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. And Mrs. Fletcher used leaves from these plants to make tea. That's her story, though she's rather confused about the details. Apparently she thought they were some sort of herb that would make a pleasant tisane. She's not much of a gardener, you understand, and doesn't always distinguish between decorative and culinary plants. This explanation troubled Miss Marple considerably. While it was true that Mrs. Fletcher was not knowledgeable about gardening, she was not a foolish woman, and it seemed unlikely that she would have used petunia leaves for tea-making, lest there had been some sort of misunderstanding or deliberate misdirection. Did she say anything else about Mrs. Elwood's visit? She mentioned that Agnes seemed rather anxious during the call, kept looking over her shoulder as though she expected someone to appear, and she was quite insistent that Mrs. Fletcher should plant the petunias immediately in a particular spot near her kitchen window where she would see them every day. The picture Dr. Haydock was painting suggested something far more sinister than a simple gardening mistake. If Agnes had been deliberately encouraging Mrs. Fletcher to place the plants where she would be most likely to use them, it implied a calculated attempt to cause harm. You said the symptoms were consistent with digitalis poisoning. Absolutely classic presentation. And here's the thing, Miss Marple. When I examined the remaining plants that Mrs. Fletcher hadn't yet put in the ground, I found that the soil was heavily contaminated with digitalis. Not just traces that might have come from nearby foxgloves, but a concentrated amount that could only have been added deliberately. Miss Marple felt a chill of genuine alarm. This was no longer a matter of mysterious correspondence and nighttime harassment. Someone had attempted to poison Mrs. Fletcher, using Agnes as an unwitting or possibly willing intermediary. Are you certain that Mrs. Elwood was aware of the contamination? Dr. Haydock considered this carefully. That's the question, isn't it? Either she was a victim of someone else's scheme, or she was actively participating in an attempt to harm Mrs. Fletcher. Given her recent behaviour, I'm afraid I'm inclined toward the latter interpretation. What possible motive could Agnes have for wanting to harm Mrs. Fletcher? That's what I was hoping you might help me understand. You've been observing the situation at Rosemount House more closely than anyone, and I thought you might have some insight into what's driving Agnes's behaviour. Miss Marple was quiet for several moments, considering the implications of this new development. The poisoned plants represented a significant escalation from the previous pattern of mysterious letters and nocturnal harassment. Someone was no longer content with frightening Agnes into compliance, but was actively using her to cause harm to innocent third parties. Doctor, did Mrs. Fletcher mention whether Agnes gave any specific instructions about caring for the plants? As a matter of fact, she did. Agnes apparently suggested that the leaves might be useful for making a soothing tea, particularly helpful for someone with Mrs. Fletcher's tendency toward insomnia. She even provided detailed instructions about how to prepare it. This removed any possibility that the poisoning had been accidental. Agnes had deliberately provided information that would lead Mrs. Fletcher to consume the contaminated plant material, knowing that the result would be serious illness or potentially death. There's something else, Doctor, Haydock continued. When I questioned Mrs. Fletcher more closely about the visit, she mentioned that Agnes seemed to be reciting prepared instructions, as though she had memorised what to say beforehand, and she kept glancing at a piece of paper she carried in her handbag, as though checking to make sure she hadn't forgotten anything. The image this created was of a woman following orders, possibly under duress, to carry out an act that she knew to be harmful. Miss Marple found herself wondering whether Agnes was being coerced into these actions by whoever had been sending her the mysterious correspondence and making nocturnal visits to her property. Have you reported this to the police? Not yet, though I'll have to if Mrs. Fletcher's condition worsens. I wanted to speak with you first, to see if you thought there might be some explanation that would make police involvement unnecessary." Miss Marple appreciated the doctor's discretion, but she was becoming convinced that the situation had progressed beyond the point where unofficial intervention would be sufficient. Someone was using Agnes to commit serious crimes, and the pattern suggested that Mrs. Fletcher might not be the only intended victim. "Doctor, I think you should know that I've been observing some very troubling behaviour at Rosemount House. Agnes is clearly under some form of pressure, possibly blackmail, and this incident with the poisoned plants may be part of a larger scheme." She provided him with a careful summary of her observations, including the mysterious nighttime activities, the burned correspondence, and the damaged gate. Dr. Haydock listened with growing concern, occasionally asking questions for clarification. "This paints a very disturbing picture," he said finally. "If Agnes is being coerced into criminal activity, she needs protection as much as punishment, but we can't allow her to be used to harm innocent people." Miss Marple agreed, though she suspected that Agnes's situation was even more complex than simple coercion. The woman's extreme fear and secretive behaviour suggested that she was protecting something or someone, possibly at considerable cost to her own safety and peace of mind. "I think the time has come for direct action," she said. "Agnes needs to be confronted with what we know and given the opportunity to explain her behaviour before the situation deteriorates further." Dr. Haydock nodded gravely. "I'll defer to your judgment on that, Miss Marple. You've always had a remarkable ability to understand these complicated human situations. But I must insist that if there's any suggestion of further attempts to harm innocent people, the police will have to be involved." After the doctor left, Miss Marple sat in her small sitting room, contemplating the escalation of events at Rosemount House. The poisoned plants represented a crossing of lines that could not be ignored or explained away as harmless eccentricity. Someone was using Agnes to commit serious crimes, and the pattern suggested a level of planning and malice that went far beyond simple village mischief. The lady's glove seemed to mock her from its hiding place in the drawer. She had been treating this as an intellectual puzzle, collecting clues and forming theories, when she should have recognised that real people were in genuine danger. Mrs. Fletcher's narrow escape from serious poisoning was a warning that could not be ignored. Tomorrow she decided she would confront Agnes directly, armed with all the evidence she had accumulated and prepared to demand the truth, regardless of how uncomfortable or dangerous that truth might prove to be. Chapter 9. A Memory from the War. Miss Marple's opportunity for confrontation came sooner than expected. The following morning, as she was preparing to call upon Agnes with her accumulated evidence, she received an unexpected visitor at her own cottage door. Agnes Elwood stood on her doorstep looking haggard and desperate, clutching a small handbag as though it contained her most precious possessions. "Miss Marple, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I simply had to speak with someone, and you've always been so kind." Agnes's voice trailed off, and Miss Marple could see that she was on the verge of complete collapse. "My dear child, of course. Please do come in and sit down. You look quite exhausted." Miss Marple settled her unexpected guest in the most comfortable chair, and busied herself with preparing tea, all the while observing Agnes carefully. The woman appeared to have aged years in the past few days, her face drawn with fatigue and her hands trembling with nervous tension. "I heard about Mrs. Fletcher," Agnes said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Haydock told me she'd been taken ill after I gave her those plants." She looked up with eyes that were filled with genuine anguish. "Miss Marple, I swear to you, I had no idea there was anything wrong with them. I thought I was simply sharing some excess flowers from my garden." Miss Marple set down the tea service and took the chair opposite her visitor. "My dear, I think the time has come for complete honesty between us. There have been rather too many mysterious occurrences recently for coincidence to be a satisfactory explanation." Agnes was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden alone. You're quite right, of course. I've been living a lie for weeks now, and it's becoming impossible to maintain." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small bundle of items. "I found these hidden in Herbert's desk after the funeral, and they've turned my entire world upside down." She placed the items on the small table between them. Miss Marple could see a faded wartime postcard, several yellowed photographs, and what appeared to be official documents wrapped in oiled cloth. "The postcard arrived in 1944, Agnes continued, her voice growing stronger as though the act of sharing her burden was providing some relief. "It was from a man named David Marsh, someone I'd been engaged to before I met Herbert. He was serving with the resistance in France, and this was the last communication I ever received from him." Miss Marple examined the postcard carefully. It bore a French postmark and showed signs of having passed through wartime censorship. The message was brief and circumspect, speaking of the hope for the future and love that would endure beyond current difficulties. "You believed he had been killed?" "That's what I was told. His commanding officer wrote to inform me that David had been captured during a mission and was presumed dead. I grieved for him, naturally, but eventually I met Herbert and began a new life." Agnes's hands trembled as she touched one of the photographs. "Then, 3 weeks ago, I received a letter that changed everything." "From David Marsh?" Agnes nodded miserably. "Very much alive, it seems, and very much aware of my current circumstances. He'd been held prisoner for over a year before managing to escape, but by the time he returned to England, I was already married to Herbert. He decided not to disrupt my new life, but he never stopped watching from a distance." Miss Marple began to see the outline of the situation that had been tormenting Agnes. "And now he's decided to make contact. More than that, I'm afraid. You see, David apparently spent the war years engaged in certain activities that were not entirely legal. Intelligence work often involved deception, false documents, that sort of thing. When the war ended, he found it difficult to return to conventional life. The implications of this revelation were becoming clear. He's been involved in criminal activities since the war. Forgery, primarily. False identities, forged papers for people who needed to disappear or start new lives. Very lucrative work, apparently, but also very dangerous." Agnes picked up one of the documents from the table. "When Herbert died and left me that unexpected inheritance, David saw an opportunity to involve me in his schemes." Miss Marple examined the document Agnes had indicated. It appeared to be some sort of certificate or official paper, though the details were difficult to make out in the dim light of her sitting room. "What sort of involvement?" "He wants me to use my respectable position in the community to help establish false identities for his clients. The perfect English widow, above suspicion, with connections throughout the village." Agnes's voice was bitter with self-recrimination. "And he's made it quite clear that if I refuse to cooperate, he'll expose certain details about Herbert's business affairs that would destroy his memory and possibly land me in legal difficulties." This explained the pattern of mysterious correspondence and nighttime visitors that Miss Marple had been observing. David Marsh was using his wartime relationship with Agnes to coerce her into criminal activity, while also threatening to expose secrets about her late husband. "What sort of secrets about Herbert?" Agnes hesitated before answering. Herbert's inheritance of this house wasn't entirely legitimate. His uncle's will was altered to ensure that Herbert received the property instead of the rightful heir. David has evidence of this forgery, and he's threatening to expose it unless I cooperate with his current schemes. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with uncomfortable clarity. Agnes was trapped between her desire to protect her husband's memory and her reluctance to become involved in ongoing criminal activity. David Marsh was exploiting both her old affection for him and her fear of scandal to force her cooperation. "And the incident with Mrs. Fletcher?" Agnes buried her face in her hands. "David gave me those plants, told me they were a gift for a lonely neighbour. He must have done something to them, knowing that Mrs. Fletcher would—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Miss Marple felt a surge of sympathy for the woman sitting across from her. Agnes had been manipulated into becoming an unwitting accomplice to attempted murder, used by someone who had once claimed to love her. My dear, you realise that this situation cannot continue. David Marsh is using you to commit serious crimes, and innocent people are being harmed. I know, but if I refuse to help him, he'll destroy Herbert's reputation and possibly send me to prison for being an accessory to the will forgery. And if I cooperate... Agnes looked up with desperate eyes. Miss Marple, I think he means to kill me once I'm no longer useful to him. He's become someone I don't recognise, someone capable of terrible things. Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk, where she kept her small store of emergency funds. The time had come for decisive action, and she suspected that conventional approaches would not be sufficient to resolve Agnes's predicament. Agnes, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You're going to stay here tonight, where you'll be safe. Tomorrow, we're going to contact the authorities and tell them everything you've told me. David Marsh may have evidence against you, but his own criminal activities will make him vulnerable to prosecution. But Herbert's reputation will survive the truth better than it would survive your continued involvement in David's schemes. And Agnes, Miss Marple's voice carried a note of gentle firmness. I believe there's something else you haven't told me yet. Something that explains why you're so terrified of this man. Agnes was quiet for a long moment before reaching into her handbag once more. She withdrew a lady's glove, identical to the one Miss Marple had hidden in her own drawer. This belonged to someone David killed in France, Agnes whispered. He kept it as a trophy. He showed it to me as proof of what he's capable of if I don't cooperate. Miss Marple felt the final pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The glove she had found near the greenhouse hadn't been dropped by accident, but had been deliberately placed there as a warning, a reminder to Agnes of the consequences of defiance. Chapter 10. Secrets Unearthed at Sunset. The morning following Agnes's desperate confession found Miss Marple in conference with Inspector Slack, the local police officer whose initial scepticism about village mysteries had been tempered by years of experience with Miss Marple's uncanny ability to uncover the truth behind seemingly innocent events. "So you're telling me," Inspector Slack said, reviewing the notes he'd taken during their lengthy discussion, "that this David Marsh has been using Mrs. Elwood to establish false identities, attempted to poison Mrs. Fletcher through contaminated plants, and has been terrorising the woman with reminders of wartime murders." "That's correct, Inspector, and I believe the situation is far more serious than even Agnes realises." Miss Marple glanced toward the spare bedroom where Agnes was still resting, exhausted by the emotional toll of finally sharing her burden. "There's the matter of the missing gardener Thomas, whose disappearance coincides rather too neatly with David's renewed presence in Agnes's life." Inspector Slack frowned. "You think something's happened to this Thomas fellow?" "I think Thomas may have discovered something about David's activities, or perhaps recognised him from their wartime service. Gardeners are observant people, Inspector, and Thomas had been with the household for 15 years. He would have noticed unusual activities around the property." The inspector consulted his notes again. Mrs. Elwood mentioned that this David Marsh has been using the greenhouse area for his meetings with her. If Thomas stumbled upon these nocturnal gatherings... Precisely. And the timing of his disappearance just as Agnes inherited that unexpected sum from Herbert's estate suggests that David may have eliminated Thomas to prevent interference with his plans. Inspector Slack rose from his chair with the decisive air of a man who had reached an unpleasant but necessary conclusion. "Right then, I think it's time we had a look at that greenhouse and the surrounding area. If there's evidence of foul play, we need to find it before this David Marsh realises that Mrs. Elwood has spoken to the authorities." Miss Marple had anticipated this development and had already made the necessary arrangements. Dr. Haydock would remain at the cottage to watch over Agnes, while she would accompany Inspector Slack to Rosemount House to direct the investigation based on her previous observations of the property. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon as they made their way through the village toward Meadowbank Lane. Miss Marple noticed that several neighbours observed their passage with interest, no doubt wondering what business the police might have at the recently bereaved widow's home. At Rosemount House, they found the gates standing open and the property seemingly deserted. The perfect garden maintained its mathematical precision, but Miss Marple noticed subtle signs of recent disturbance that had not been present during her previous visits. "The greenhouse is at the back of the property," she informed Inspector Slack as they made their way along the main path, near the fruit trees, in an area that would be screened from observation by neighbours. As they approached the small building, Miss Marple pointed out the signs of recent soil disturbance that she had first noticed during her unauthorised morning exploration. "The ground has been dug and relaid here, Inspector, rather more extensively than one would expect for normal gardening activities." Inspector Slack examined the area with professional interest. "Aye, you're right about that. This looks like someone's been doing some serious excavation work." He gestured toward the greenhouse itself. "And that building's been modified recently. New locks on the door, boards over some of the windows. Not the sort of changes you'd make for growing plants." They circled the greenhouse carefully, noting additional evidence of recent activity. Behind the building, partially concealed by a dense stand of rhododendrons, they discovered a collection of tools that appeared to have been used for digging. More significantly, Miss Marple spotted traces of the same green paint she had observed on the broken gate, confirming the connection between the greenhouse area and the nocturnal harassment of Agnes. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I think we should examine the area beneath the rose arbour more closely. The soil disturbance seems most extensive there." They moved to the elegant structure where climbing roses created a natural canopy over a small seating area. The ground here showed clear signs of having been recently excavated and carefully restored, though the work had been done with considerable skill to minimise obvious evidence. Inspector Slack produced a folding spade from his equipment bag and began to probe the suspicious area. Within minutes, his efforts were rewarded by the distinctive sound of metal striking something solid beneath the surface. "There's something here, all right," he announced grimly. "Something that doesn't belong in a flower garden." The excavation proceeded carefully, with Miss Marple maintaining watch for any sign of David Marsh's return, while Inspector Slack gradually revealed what lay beneath the roses. As the sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the perfect garden, the true secret of Rosemount House finally came to light. The remains they uncovered were those of an elderly man, buried in a shallow grave and covered with lime to accelerate decomposition. Even in the deteriorated state of the remains, Miss Marple could see enough to confirm her suspicions about the missing gardener's fate. "Poor Thomas," she murmured. "He must have discovered David's presence on the property and threatened to expose him." Inspector Slack examined the scene with grim professionalism. "Murdered, certainly, probably struck from behind, judging by the position, and buried hastily, though whoever did this tried to make it look like careful garden maintenance. David would have had to eliminate Thomas to prevent interference with his plans for Agnes," Miss Marple observed. "A loyal servant of 15 years' standing would never have allowed his mistress to be terrorised and coerced." As they prepared to secure the scene and call for additional assistance, Miss Marple noticed movement at the house. A figure appeared at one of the upper windows, watching their activities with evident interest. "Inspector," she said urgently, "I believe we're being observed." Inspector Slack looked up at the house and immediately reached for his whistle. "David Marsh, I presume? The man's got brass, I'll give him that. Returning to the scene while we're conducting the investigation." The figure at the window disappeared, and moments later they heard the sound of the front door opening. A man appeared on the terrace, tall and lean, with prematurely grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Even at this distance, Miss Marple could see the resemblance to the young soldier in the wartime photographs Agnes had shown her. "Good afternoon," David Marsh called out, his voice carrying easily across the garden. "I trust you're not damaging Mrs. Elwood's beautiful roses with your excavations." Inspector Slack stepped forward, his hand resting on his truncheon. "David Marsh, I presume. You're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Blackwood and the attempted murder of Mrs. Fletcher." David's response was a cold smile that confirmed Miss Marple's assessment of him as someone who had moved far beyond the idealistic young man who had once fought for freedom in occupied France. I think you'll find that rather difficult to prove, Inspector. After all, poor Agnes has been under considerable strain lately. Widowhood affects people in the most unpredictable ways, and her behaviour has been quite erratic. We have Mrs. Elwood's full confession of your activities, Inspector Slack replied firmly, and the evidence of Thomas's murder speaks for itself. Does it indeed? David moved closer, and Miss Marple could see that he carried something in his right hand, though the failing light made it difficult to determine exactly what. I'm afraid Agnes has been rather confused lately. The stress of her situation has affected her judgment considerably. Miss Marple realised with growing alarm that David was positioning himself to prevent their escape from the garden. The greenhouse blocked one route, the house another, and he was systematically cutting off their access to the main gate. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe Mr. Marsh has no intention of allowing us to leave this garden with our evidence intact. David's smile widened, and Miss Marple saw that her assessment had been correct. They had uncovered the truth about Thomas's murder and David's coercion of Agnes, but their investigation had also placed them in mortal danger from a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to kill to protect his secrets.